Hello and welcome back. I'm so happy you're here. Today I decided to play around with my Gelli Plate using alcohol inks to color the base of a wood panel for a mixed media project. So these bottles of alcohol ink that I'm using here have 1/3 of the alcohol ink color and then 2/3 of isopropyl alcohol. It's just to lighten the shade and help it spread a little bit more evenly. If you wanted the colors darker, you could go straight from the alcohol ink bottle and then you could just add some iso to soften the colors wherever you wanted. So I'm lifting the plate to help blend my colors around. I want to have kind of a smooth transition between the colors. I don't want there to be streaks of all of them. So I'm just making sure that my plate is entirely covered and the colors are blended a little bit. So my plate here is an 8x10 plate, and my panel that I'm using or creating on is 8x10 as well. Once I have the alcohol inks how I want them, I let them dry completely. So they've already dried. I'm going to use an alcohol lift ink pad and lift some of that ink up and get a little bit more pattern on the background. So while you're doing this, keep in mind that what you're doing is opposite of how it's going to look in your project. And also clean your stamp off between each time. Otherwise, you're going to be transferring that alcohol ink back to your pad and getting a little bit dirty. So I did it with some alcohol lift ink pad, and then after that I stamped with some StazOn. And it worked. You got a little bit of extra texture on that background, but by my final product, I didn't actually see what it was that I did here. So keep in mind what you're envisioning for your final project and do your stamping accordingly so that you're actually going to be able to see some of this texture that you're creating. Once I'm done my stamping, I'm going to cover the entire plate with a thin coat of acrylic paint. I'm using an off-white here because I wanted my base coat to have a bit of a warmer feel. And when I was jelly printing these inks with white, it felt a little bit too cold for me. Then you're going to put your wood panel down and make sure to press really, really well to get the ink all over this surface. Now that the front of my panel is done, I'm repeating that process minus all of the stamping just to be able to cover the sides of the wood panel and have it have the same look as the front. So I'm putting all my inks on the Gelli Plate. I'm gonna move them around to blend them and then let it completely dry, cover with some acrylic paint, the same color as the front, and I'm gonna transfer that ink to the sides of the panel. Now I don't want to waste any of the paint that is left on the Gelli Plate, so I am taking a print of it that will be used later on in the project. If you want to seal your work at any point, use Camar varnish from Crackle. It's the best one that I have found to use with alcohol inks. So now I'm using a stencil and I'm going to put some layers of texture paste down. So this first image that I'm just using some regular Crackle texture paste. and I'm centering it in the center of my panel. I do plan on having my focal point on the center of the panel, so part of this is going to be covered. Now my stencil has some half flowers in it, so I am paying attention to which ones I'm getting onto my project, and I'm only using the images that have full flowers. Now, like I said, my focal point is going to be on the center of the canvas. So part of this stencil is covering some of that texture paste I just put down and is going to smush it. It's going to be covered in the final project. If you were worried about that and didn't want it to be smushed, you do need to wait for that first layer of crackle paste to dry completely. Now I'm using a second stencil with some matte texture paste. I use 4 different texture pastes in total on this project, a little bit of each because each one has a different texture to it. And the thing that I love with mixed media projects is all the different textures that are created. So I'm just going to put it in 2 spots on the back edge of my project just to add a little bit of different texture. That the paste that I've put down so far completely dries. You also want to make sure to remove any paste that has gone outside of your wood panel and keep a nice neat finish. Now I'm adding some splatters of the Pinata Brass. It's just a nice metallic, and I had intended to put it with my alcohol ink background when I was planning my project in my head, but completely forgot. So now I'm doing it so that it can dry with the paste. My first layer of paste has completely dried, so now I'm using some transparent grit paste and just adding a little bit more of those flowers in the top left corner, and then I'm going to put it in the bottom right corner. The last paste type that I'm using here is just an opaque grit paste, just to add a little bit of white gritty texture around some of the edges, just to frame it a little bit. And once those pastes are down, it needs to dry completely before moving on to the next part. While waiting for the paste on the panel to dry, I'm going to use some Distress Collage medium and collage the print of the excess alcohol ink on my plate onto a piece of cardstock because I want to die cut it. And the paper that I typically use when I do jelly printing is just printer paper, so it's not thick enough for what I want. So easy solution is just to collage it onto some cardstock to give it a little bit more substance. Once that collage glue dries, I am going to die cut some leaves, and I'm going to place them in certain places so I get some of the more interesting parts of that jelly print. Before doing this die cutting, make sure that you clean your collage brush because that is glue and it's going to ruin your brush if you let it dry. So do make sure that that gets cleaned so that the glue doesn't dry. So I'm just choosing different parts of the leftover print to die cut. So the focal point of this project is going to be this perspective moth. So I do die cut it in some Yupo, and you'll see me putting alcohol ink on it later on. I'm going to take some Foundry wax and I'm going to highlight the edges of the die cut leaves. Now this is a very similar color to the Pinata Brass alcohol ink that I'm using, so they're going to work well with each other. You do need to work fairly quickly with the Foundry wax as it does dry quite quickly. I ended up squeezing too much on my mat, so I'm going to use some of the leftovers to highlight some of the edges of my wood panel. Once all of the ink is completely dry, you're going to use a heat tool to heat it, and it's going to bring all the leafing up out of that Foundry wax. Clean up any Foundry wax on your surface, just use some isopropyl alcohol and it wipes right up. Now I'm using the two darker colors and I'm going to color the body of my moth. Now I decided that I wanted to have the wings mostly white, and I'm just going to put some of the brass around the edges of the wings. So I squeezed some of the brass onto my surface and I'm going to paint them on the wings, and this is when I realized that I actually didn't clean my brush, so it actually paints on a little bit of the burgundy is the color that I was using with the brush with before. To fix it, I just took my bottle of Pinata brass and applied it directly to the wing. And here is how the moth looks as it's dried. And I'm just gonna put it in the center and lay some things out. I ended up deciding I wanted my center to be a little bit darker, so I do take two of the darker colors and add a little bit to some of the texture paste just to bring up the texture of that paste as well. And while I'm laying things out, I do decide it needs a little bit more color to really bring out that center part and make it pop. So I take those same leaves that I die cut before and I'm going to die cut them in some gold vellum. I also feel it needs some darker die cut, so I'm going to take these two darker colors and put it on some glossy cardstock with a little bit of Pinata Brass. I'm using my alcohol ink blower to blow it around, and then I'm going to die cut a flower die cut that is very similar to the stencil that I used on the center focal point as well as the upper left hand side and the lower right hand side. I'm also going to die cut that flower in some white cardstock as well. Now I'm going to lay everything out to position it how I like it before starting to glue it all down. Now that I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to use some Distress Collage Medium with a fine tip bottle, and I'm going to glue everything down. And then I'm going to weigh it down so that it has good contact with the surface below it to make sure it stays exactly where I want it, and then let it dry completely. Once everything's completely dry, I'm using my finger to put a little bit of those two darker colors just on the outside of the wood panel. Keep in mind this is going to completely stain your finger, so if that bothers you, use some gloves. We don't have a dishwasher, so I'm washing dishes several times a day, so when I stain my fingers, it doesn't last very long because it usually gets washed off pretty quickly. But like I said, if you don't want to stain your finger, use some gloves or use a brush. Now I'm using a script stamp with that same gray StazOn pad that I used at the beginning on my Gelli Plate, and I'm just adding some subtle script texture to the background. At this point, I thought I was completely done, but I end up putting some glossy accents on the center of the moth just to give it a bit of a different texture and make that pop. And once the glossy accents is down, if there's any bubbles, pop it with a needle. I need to let it dry completely. Thank you so much for being here and watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe, as well as the notification bell to be notified of new videos. So this is what the glossy accents look like when it's wet. It will turn completely clear as it's dry. Now it's completely dry and it really makes the center of the image pop.